From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later on tonight, the Afterlife. Emerging artist bumper music for the first couple hours. Those that have websites, they're listed at coasttocoastam.com. Here's what's happening. A tragic nightclub fire in Spain claimed the lives of at least 13 people. Firefighters sharing footage of them fighting the blaze on social media. The emergency crews are still searching for people unaccounted for after responding to the adjoining clubs early Sunday morning in the outskirts of a city in southeast Spain. Sad story there. Vladimir Putin's closest ally has threatened to unleash World War III on the West if the United Kingdom sends troops to the Ukrainian soil. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said that any Brit soldiers training soldiers inside Ukraine would be legitimate targets for Russian forces and ruthlessly destroyed. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Charles R. Smith, of course, our expert on these kinds of matters. Charlie, is he serious or what?
Yes and no. It's more of the same. We've seen the defense minister, the various politicians in Russia threaten nuclear strikes and various other sundries. And, of course, you and I have witnessed the continuous grinding war in the Ukraine, and the Russians are slowly losing.
They are slowly losing, there's no question. But, Vladimir Putin's a loose cannon, isn't he?
He can be unpredictable, but unleashing that kind of retaliation, especially looking at the vast array of weapon systems assorted against them, not really a good idea, both locally as well as physically for your own political nature. They're looking for a way out, but they're not quite sure how to do it yet. We've already seen several different peace proposals. We'll, guarantee your borders if you agree not to join NATO, I think was the last one. We'll probably see more. The real key here, I think, is support coming in from Iran, North Korea, and China. A large number of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, cruise missiles, and artillery systems.
And North Korea says they may send troops to help Russia.
Well, yeah, but that's questionable, and how effective that would be as well. The North doesn't have a lot to lose. There's no doubt about that. But something like that would probably be not a real great big impact in the local area unless they decide to move large numbers of troops. And again, the North Koreans most likely couldn't afford to do that, even if they were provided with the funding. Again, all politics is local.
You got that right. Charlie, thanks. Appreciate it. In a moment, Benjamin Baruch joins us to talk about this and some other issues. Looking for an easy way to boost your heart health? The secret might be as simple as opting for stairs. The new research reveals that regularly climbing stairs might be your heart's secret ally against a condition known as cardiovascular disease. This condition can cause your arteries to narrow and harden due to plaque, leading to arteries and heart diseases and strokes. For the first time in more than 3 years, the federal student loan borrowers will be required to pay their monthly student loans starting in October. Get ready, you'll get a notice. Jeffrey Long has been a radiation oncologist in Kentucky for 37 years. He has studied more than 5,000 near-death experiences, and he says studying near-death experiences had made him a better cancer doctor, and that his research has convinced everyone without a doubt that there's life after death. Here to tell us more is Sandra Champlain, who hosts Shades of the Afterlife on the Paranormal Podcast Network. Hi, Sandra.
Well, hi, George. We all have that moment when we get fascinated by the afterlife. And for Jeffrey Long, yes, it was 37 years ago. He was flipping through a journal from the American Medical Association, and there it was. He saw an article describing near-death experiences, NDEs. And from that moment, he was hooked. And, yes, he went on to study more than 5,000 experiences and is certain that there's an afterlife. He says about 45% of the people that have them seem to hover over their body and see what's happening below, like one woman who saw a doctor throwing a medical tool on the floor, and that's something the doctor later confirmed. And yes, we've all heard about the tunnel, the bright light, being greeted by loved ones and pets, and there's an overwhelming sense of love, and people feel this other realm is their real home. Now, he's also studied something called fear-death experiences, and they're like the near-miss car accidents. They don't have a tunnel or the light, but often people witness their own accidents from outside of their body, and they see their life flashing before their eyes. In this life review, George, they can recall accurate information from being a baby or maybe a toddler that is later confirmed by family members. So I'd like to read in the words of Dr. Long, while I'm passionate about NDEs, my day job still revolves around helping patients fight cancer. I don't tell my patients about my NDE research, and yet my work with NDEs has made me a more compassionate and loving doctor. He goes on to say, I'm able to help my patients face life-threatening diseases with increased courage and passion. My goal is to help them have more healthy days here on Earth. But I firmly believe that if and when they pass, they won't be alone. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Sandra. Talk to you next month. You can hear Sandra on Shades of the Afterlife on the Paranormal Podcast Network. In a moment, biblical prophecy. What does it has to do with what's happening today? Benjamin Baruch joins us next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. We've got a great program to get your week rolling here. Benjamin Baruch back with us, professional financial advisor, author, public speaker, also a chartered financial analyst and certified public accountant, acts as a financial advisor to some of the largest privately held real estate companies in America. His academic background includes studies in international finance and economics at UCLA and graduate studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His history and psychology of the Middle East conflict, he's an expert in as well. Benjamin is a recognized expert in real estate taxation, and his professional experience includes the management of institutional investment portfolios. Benjamin, welcome back. How have you been?
I've been good. Thank you, George. Great to be here.
It's a perfect time for you. I don't know whether to talk to you first about biblical prophecy or the real estate market and what's happening to housing.
Well, why don't we go over sort of the news bites, and then we can maybe tie in the prophecy towards the end.
Absolutely. You heard the story I just had that the former head of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, is Putin's right-hand man, claiming that if the United Kingdom sends troops into Ukraine, it could be an all-out World War III. What do you think of that?
Well, Russian political leaders, Russian news, media personalities, officials within the Russian military have been talking about a nuclear war with the West for the better part of the last year. And they're not really making idle threats. The nuclear arsenal that Russia possesses is far greater than America's arsenal today. And so they do have the ability to destroy the United Kingdom, which was Medvedev's latest comment, that if the British were to train Ukrainian forces in Ukraine, perhaps Russia should simply eradicate the Commonwealth and destroy Britain, which they could do in probably less than 20 minutes. Now, you get into the whole concept of retaliation and mutually assured destruction, and the fact that the West's primary defense against a nuclear strike is a doctrine from the Cold War in the 1950s. And as you look at this assured destruction argument, it was valid. It made strategic sense in 1959. It made strategic sense in the 1960s when we built the B-52 fleet. It's not as compelling an argument in a world of hypersonic missiles or a world of space-based weapons.
Exactly. I know after being in the Navy 9 years, one of our great deterrents are our nuclear subs. which are stationed all over the place, and they could hit Russia, China within minutes as well. Nobody wins.
Well, not exactly, because first of all, at most we only have 4 tridents at sea at any one time, and they don't have the launch codes. They have to raise up a radio buoy, and they have to receive the launch codes through the emergency action system. So without the codes, they can't do anything. And the Russians have unmanned submarines that sit off the coast of the United States, off our submarine bases.
Yes, they do.
And they follow the tridents around. So the Russians have a pretty good idea where the trident submarines are. And they have anti-submarine torpedoes that have 20 megaton nuclear warheads on board. And they don't have to get any closer than 100 kilometers, and the concussion will crush the hull. So, it's entirely plausible that the Trident fleet could be sunk before they know what happened.
Benjamin, why aren't we sitting down with Russia saying, let's stop this craziness? What do we need to do?
Because the shadow government that is attempting to take complete control of the earth for the forces of the Antichrist, if you will, are looking to create World War III. This is the event of World War III is the crisis that allows the one world government to suddenly take control of the planet. Following World War III, the world will be effectively destroyed.
So they're having a field day right now.
They want this war to accelerate to ultimate nuclear exchange. But, you have to understand, first of all, truth is the first casualty of war. And that has never been more evident than in this current war in Ukraine, where, both sides are producing nothing but propaganda. And for obvious reasons, there's a military advantage to reporting propaganda. This kind of reminds me of the Vietnam War, which I watched on television as a young boy. And I remember every week we got the update on the war. And the United States was winning and winning and winning. And we were winning that war for a decade or more until we lost.
And then we just lose it.
Yeah, it turned out we actually weren't winning. They were just exaggerating these victories. Well, today the Western media is telling us that, Ukraine is winning. Of course, this counteroffensive hasn't really gained much real estate, but all the official pronouncements are that Ukraine's winning, the Russian military is being devastated, and there's no question there's substantial losses on both sides. This is a really serious war that has started.
It sure
and
is.
The Russians have definitely lost some major military assets.
Oh, sure.
And it's been NATO missiles, which there's pretty good evidence to indicate that NATO forces, U.S. forces, have been involved in the targeting, perhaps even, the guidance, perhaps even launching some of these missiles. There's been evidence of NATO troops being captured inside Ukraine. The Russians have put this in the media, but it hasn't hit the Western media. But, to back up a step, the Russians have been planning for an eventual nuclear war with the United States going all the way back to the 1950s.
Do they really want this?
Yes, actually, they consider it to be the only way that they can complete their global conquest of communism. They have to eliminate the United States, and if they're successful in destroying the United States as a nuclear superpower, the rest of the nations fold. It's the domino theory in reverse. They can take out America. Who can stand? And, the other thing that people are not focusing on is we're not talking about just the Russian military fighting NATO in Ukraine with the Ukrainian army as proxy forces. We're talking about China preparing for war. We're talking about Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas preparing for war in the Middle East. We're talking about North Korea preparing for war. We're talking about foreign troops in Canada, foreign troops pouring across the southern border of the United States. Thousands of Chinese military personnel are coming across dressed in civilian garb. We have a silent invasion occurring today. So, this war is far more complex than most people realize. And the dimensions of the threat we face are the most severe in the history of our country. And our enemy has been continually threatening nuclear war, and nobody takes them seriously. But the reality is their submarines are off our coast. They could launch cruise missiles from these submarines that would be detonating in Western cities within a matter of minutes.
Yep.
They have the ability to blind our early warning satellites in NORAD, and their hypersonic glide missiles can actually be fired south instead of over the North Pole. These glide vehicles can go across the South Pole, come up at the southern Atlantic, come through the Gulf of Mexico. We have no radar detection capabilities to the south of our country at all. We won't even see this coming.
And what about an EMP attack that simply knocks out our power grid, Benjamin?
And they don't even need an EMP attack because they've been inside our internet systems for a decade. The daily cyber attacks on just our electric utility industry is over 100,000 cyber attacks a day. They've already announced publicly that they could shut down a single American company, which they blackmailed a number of our pipelines. They blackmailed some of the casinos, and this is the Russian mafia or Chinese hackers, but they're operating under the control or direction of the governments. We're already at war. We're in a world war, and we don't even realize it. And we're acting like this is some kind of regional conflict, similar to Afghanistan when we provided some Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen in the 1980s. No, this war has been planned, and it's being executed brilliantly. The Russians and the Chinese are playing chess with us, and our leaders are playing checkers. While they're not trying to find their shoes. And so, we have a serious problem here. But, if you go back to the inception of the Russian analysis of how to prosecute a war against the United States, and Colonel Stanislav Lunev was the senior military officer in the GRU who was in charge of the planning for World War III for over 30 years, eventually defecting to the United States. And
he's the one who said there's suitcase nukes in this country.
That's correct. They smuggled satchel suitcase nukes in, which could be detonated near our B-52 bases, and you can say goodbye to the Strategic Air Command. Our early warning satellites can be blinded, our Trident submarines can be destroyed, and the 400 land-based ICBMs, if they get out of the ground, can be neutralized in outer space by space-based EMP detonations with S-400 systems.
Benjamin, why can't people just get along?
Why are there people like, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, the Great Khan? I mean, why do men want to rule the earth? Because of the sin nature of humanity.
Power mongers. Are you more concerned about Russia or China right now?
Well, they're working in an alliance. China is providing munitions. They're building Russian, T-14 tanks. And Korea's supplying ammunition. I mean, this is an axis of evil that we refuse to recognize. But the point I was trying to make, back in 1941, when Japan attacked the United States in Pearl Harbor, the Russian KGB determined that Japan lost World War II on December 7th. Because politically, Japan had showed itself to be a pariah. It engaged in an unprovoked act of aggression attacking the United States. There was no way they would ever win the political war. And the Russian KGB was smart enough to realize winning the military victory isn't even half of the battle. You have to emerge from the war not only victorious militarily, you have to win the political victory, which means you have to prove you've engaged in a just war and that your actions were defensive. And that is exactly the current strategy that Russia's been pursuing in Ukraine. They're not trying to win Ukraine in the sense that we think. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who,
God rest his soul.
Yeah, what a patriot, what an American hero. He died a little over a year ago. I actually interviewed him a few weeks before his death and got his perspective on the very first year of the war in Ukraine. And I'd like to just share a couple of his comments, if I may. And this is Dr. Pry.
Yeah, we're going to hit a break soon, but go ahead.
Sure. He basically said, what if Russia never wanted a quick victory in Ukraine? What if Russia is playing chess with the West and the Western leaders are merely playing checkers? Maybe it's not true that Russia wanted to even conquer Ukraine. Russia's capable of blitzkrieg war. Look how quickly they took Crimea in 2014. They have a history of fighting long, protracted wars that go on for years. Americans assume that the Russians think like we do and that they must want a quick end to this war because that's what we would want. But totalitarian regimes see a lot of positive things that come from long, protracted wars. It helps unite the country. Putin is now more popular inside Russia than ever. And the attacks on Moscow, I'm interjecting my own comments, the attacks on civilians in Russian territory, this is hardening the Russian political resolve.
Hold on for a second, Benjamin. We'll be back in a moment. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie with Benjamin Baruch. His website is his name, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. He's got a few books out there, including The New Tactics of Global War. Benjamin, you were talking about this tense situation with Russia and China, and the break hit us. I'd like you to finish that up.
Yeah, we did publish a book. Jeff Nyquist and I published The New Tactics of Global War following Russia's invasion of Crimea, and we outlined their long-term strategy for a world war against the United States, in which they've been joined by an alliance of evil, an axis of evil has been formed. The Ukrainian invasion was just the first phase of this global war, and even though there's been small territorial gains in terms of Russia's occupation of eastern Ukraine, this has not been a small war. It's a major war that's being fought. It's caused a huge drain on NATO munitions stockpiles. We're running out of artillery shells. We can't continue the rate of fire. We don't have the inventory to fight defensive wars to protect the NATO countries in the event this war were to expand. So, maybe Russia wasn't trying to conquer Ukraine. Maybe they were just trying to commit NATO to a war that ultimately we couldn't prosecute because we don't have the manufacturing capability to produce the vast munitions required in a large conventional war today.
It's crazy times.
It's crazy. And, everybody seems to be ignoring the fact that China has also been preparing for war. The Chinese economy now is in sort of a free fall. Their real estate market's collapsing. This is a result of 2 years of mobilization that has occurred in which China has basically refocused their entire economy from producing widgets to be sold in the West to producing military gear to be used in war with the West. And the mobilization is not free. It creates a huge drag on the economy. Soldiers are pulled from the labor force. A huge drag on government budgets because the cost of preparing for war is quite high. A number of people are speculating that China will stand down because their economy is basically on the verge of collapse. And they're assuming this because they believe the Western media reports of Russia's supposed poor performance in the war in Ukraine. But what if this is all a ruse? What if we're literally being head-faked?
Yep.
We're making a pawn sacrifice of a few forces in Ukraine to give the appearance that they're weak while they're actually rotating their forces in to gain real battlefield experience as a precursor to a much wider world war to come. Western analysts have said that, the U.S. has a devastating plan to defeat China if they invade Taiwan. Well, what if China's not planning on invading Taiwan? What if that's merely another diversion, another deception, another head fake?
A ruse.
The merchant marine ships that would carry Chinese troops to Taiwan have a range sufficient to carry them to California. Now, a number of analysts, Kyle Bass, one of the ones I respect the most, made the statement that he believes Xi Jinping is really going to do this. They're really going to war. And the senior military officials know this inside the U.S., that war is on the horizon, a war that now will include China. And their surrogate state, North Korea, no doubt will be engaged as well. And Iran is planning to open another front in the Middle East. And so we're going to have this massive world war on our hands. But what if it turns out that China is not preparing to invade Taiwan at all, but they're actually preparing to invade the United States, and that it would be the first act of war would be a massive nuclear strike on the country.
Interesting
Our country's
take.
defenseless. Our electric grid, well, what kind of defense do we have around the electric grid? A chain-link fence with a little barbed wire?
Oh, the grid would go down instantly, Benjamin.
9 substations could take down the entire grid. And, we have to buy those transformers from China.
From China.
We can't even manufacture the equipment to repair our own electric grid. I mean, the United States political and military strategy has been one of blind, suicide. We've walked off a cliff. We're in a position today where we can't replace Javelin missiles because we don't have the electronic components that were subcontracted to China. And the fact we would shift our defense production to a country that is clearly an enemy of the United States is absolutely absurd. But, the PLA is actively preparing for war. In March of this year, China began building new air raid shelters on the east coast of their country and massive combat hospitals. People in China can now raise their social credit score by donating blood. China is taking active financial steps to insulate itself from the potential sanctions that would occur if they go to war with the West. And these sanctions include, they have basically liquidated about a third of their treasury portfolio, which at its peak was $1.2 trillion. Now they're down to about $800 billion, which could be sold in a matter of months given the size and liquidity of the treasury market. But no one is thinking outside of the box on this one. If China totally divested of their treasury holdings, it would kind of reveal their hand that they were planning on imminent war. Right now, the brightest minds in the country are thinking China's going to go to war within the next 12 months. But what if it was much sooner? And why would they even care if they own $800 billion of treasury bonds if they can successfully destroy the United States in a nuclear strike followed by an actual invasion? The U.S. dollar would become worthless. U.S. Treasury bonds would be worthless. So on paper, they would lose $850 billion.
Well, and they're already part of the BRICS nations that have used a different currency now.
But think about it, George. If they were able to defeat the United States, and there are military assessments that conclude that not only can, but it's highly likely that they would succeed if they launch a massive nuclear strike, then China would be the manufacturing base of the world that survived the war. They'd be in the same position the United States was in at the end of World War II. They could just simply print $800 billion worth of yuan currency and tell the nations of the world that would all be in an economic depression because the destruction of the U.S. would crash the world economy. They would tell the nations of the world that they're going to have a Chinese Marshall Plan, and they're going to lend money to all these countries to buy goods produced in China. And China becomes the world's reserve currency, and communism the world's government. And the American people never see it coming.
Of course, the retaliation would still occur, Benjamin. I'm convinced of that.
Well, if we were able to retaliate, the last time that we built a conventional nuclear warhead was in the early 1990s. The newest warheads we have are almost 30 years old. There are some experts in the Department of Defense that basically said we're afraid to test one of our nuclear warheads because it might turn out it's a dud.
It won't work.
They don't work at this point. They do have a shelf life. But, also consider this fact. The political leadership in Russia and in China, they'll be in underground bunkers when they declare war on the United States. If we successfully get a few missiles off, so we kill a few 100 million Chinese, well, they have a problem feeding their population anyway. It would almost be doing them a favor in the way that the communist leadership in China thinks. And the Russians, they've actually calculated the risk of American retaliation in the coming World War, and they've concluded that at most they would lose, in terms of military forces, about the same amount of people they lost in Stalingrad in a day or two when they were fighting the Germans.
What happened to that Wagner leader, Prigozhin? Did he die in that plane crash or not?
Well, there's so much disinformation. I mean, it's hard to verify. Perhaps he did, or, perhaps he's sitting on a mega yacht in the Mediterranean. I really don't know. I can't confirm either way.
You don't cross Putin and get away with it.
Well, and I'm not sure he crossed him. It could have all been staged. There's a whole lot of deception that goes into warfare. Deception is the most powerful part of warfare. But, we're looking at a situation where China has been actively preparing for war. Xi Jinping has been going around for the last year or two giving public speeches telling the Chinese people and the Chinese government and the Chinese military, prepare for war with the United States. They're not kidding. And they have been preparing for war. And the Chinese military advances are tremendous. They now have a Navy that's bigger than the United States. They've got more ICBM missile launchers than the United States. And, George, there's one huge piece of this calculus that everybody kind of leaves out. One of the leading analysts I was listening to today said, well, the U.S. has 11 nuclear-powered carriers. China only has 2, and they're just diesel-powered. But, everybody forgets the fact that the aircraft carrier is an obsolete platform in the era of hypersonic missiles. Because one hypersonic missile destroys the entire carrier.
Well, it takes it right out.
Now, there are advances being made today in directed energy weapons. The Israelis have made some great advances. The United States is on the verge of advances. But, the communists today have the military advantage with hypersonic missiles. We have been unable to successfully develop a hypersonic missile that will fly. Our tests are all failures. So we've built the biggest carrier task force ever. But, if you look back over history, the end of an empire was also witness to the end or the obsolescence of the military platform that projected that empire's power. When the British Empire was ready to collapse following World War I, the battleship was obsolete. Nobody built any more of them. They were sank in World War II, and they were replaced with the carrier. Well, today, the carrier is obsolete. Those battle groups will be sunk. I've actually seen military plans that were confiscated or captured by Western intelligence agencies of a plan to sink the entire U.S. Navy in 1 hour with a massive hypersonic missile attack. Now, we will likely get off some retaliatory strikes. But, you're dealing with men that calculate the loss of life as a calculus of obtaining political power. The Russians lost, 20 million people in World War
II? Yeah.
They won't lose 2 million in World War III.
Crazy
at least
times.
As far as their calculations are concerned. So,
now, how does this tie into biblical prophecy, Benjamin?
Well, it ties into biblical prophecy because a nuclear war against the United States is clearly in the Scriptures. The fact that the United States is anti-mystery Babylon is in Jeremiah 50:51. The fact that it would rule the earth for 70 years and then face imminent judgment was prophesied by Jeremiah in chapter 25, verse 12. The second half of that verse, dealing with the land of the Chaldeans, which shall become a perpetual desolation, is a reference to the nuclear annihilation of the United States. The balance of Jeremiah chapter 25 from verse 13 on, where the citizens of America are taken into slavery by the invading ground forces, where then God enters into judgment with all the nations of the earth, and where the slain of the Lord are from one end of the earth to the other. None of these events occurred in the fall of ancient Babylon. This is the fall of a successive empire at the end of the age. And what is the leading superpower, the most wealthy, the most proud, and now the most vile of nations, that at one time was a nation that had morality and righteousness and was the envy of the whole earth? The whole world looked up to America in 1945. When the NATO treaty was signed in 1949, America was the de facto leader of the free world. Now America has been basically dethroned. America has been revealed to be what it really is. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was bombed, the Russians didn't blow up their own pipeline. Nobody buys that story, except for maybe people that believe the New York Times. It's very obvious that the United States engaged in the most massive act of industrial terrorism in the history of the world against our own ally, which is Germany, in order to force Europe to require U.S.-based petroleum and to turn off the demand for Russian gas. So, we're in a situation where this stuff is happening in real time, and we're past the date. But in terms of Bible prophecy, the most amazing breakthrough or insight, if you will, the prophecies of Daniel chapter 9, dealing with the 70 weeks or the 77s in which these events would come to pass, and in which give us insight into the timing of the appearance of the Lord Jesus Christ. The first half of the prophecy dealt with his birth in the year 2 BC, which was exactly 62 weeks following the commandment of Artaxerxes, king of Media-Persia, authorizing Nehemiah and Ezra to go back to Israel and rebuild the city. And at the end of the age, again, a prophecy of the appearance of the Lord as the man-child coming in his people as God Almighty, the Lion of Judah, before he comes in the clouds of glory on the very last day. These prophecies, which everyone understands pertain to the city of Jerusalem, the text in Daniel 9, verse 24, actually reads, 77s are determined upon the people of Israel and the holy city. There's two prophecies there, George, and nobody's focused on the prophecy of Israel. And the sevens for the prophecy regarding the nation of Israel are Sabbath years. 7 is the Sabbath day. The 7th year is the Sabbath year, and 7 Sabbath years represent the compass of a jubilee. The prophecy is telling us from the birth of the nation of Israel, which was the Exodus under Moses, which took place approximately 1450 BC, until the coming of the Mighty One in judgment in the earth, there would be 70 jubilees, or roughly 3,500 years. But the final jubilee, the 70th jubilee of Israel, is a spiritual jubilee, not a civil jubilee. And we don't have time to go into the details, but what that means is the jubilee would be 25 years following the last civil jubilee. Well, Israel was restored during a jubilee. Jesus was born in 2 BC on a jubilee. Israel won their war of independence and became a free state in 1949, a jubilee. 1999, 50 years later, was a jubilee. And the 70th jubilee of Israel, in which God is going to complete his work. 7 is the number of perfection. 10 is the number of completion. And so God is going to complete the work of the total redemption of his people in a spiritual jubilee, in which the spiritual life of the people is altered. That will occur 25 years following 1999.
Hold on for a second, Benjamin. We're at the top of the hour. We'll be back with more.